We have decided on the question, how have attitudes towards the memorialisation of Bristol's involvement in forced labour changed over time? And within this question we will focus on the statue of Edward Colston, which stood in central Bristol until June 2020, when it was torn down by protesters for the Black Lives Matter movement. We have decided to focus on attitudes to the memorialisation of slavery, as it is a very current issue with widespread debates, a clear example being the toppling of the Colston statue. The modern debates in Bristol around this topic made us curious about why the statue was built in the first place, particularly as it was not erected until over 170 years after Colston's death. We were intrigued as to how attitudes at the time of the statue's construction in 1885 compared to modern attitudes. Colston remains a celebrated figure in Bristol, despite his role as an official in the Royal African Company and records showing his direct involvement in the approval and sale and transport of African slaves. Recent conflict around his memorialisation provides a good example that represents wider debates. We are interested in how, despite the fact that statues remain the same, the context around them changes. In this presentation, we will set out how we would go about researching and answering this question. In order to answer the question, we would need to access information about attitudes to the Colston statue in the past. The Bristol Archives and the collection of Bristol museums would be essential to this, as they contain historical documents which could help us understand attitudes at the time the statue was constructed. Although some documents have been digitalised and are therefore available online, some have not, so visiting in person would be useful. The statue was constructed in 1895, over 170 years after Colston's death, which is interesting. The idea for the statue came from James William Arrowsmith, and there is evidence to show that he was aware of Colston's involvement in the slave trade and the role of the slave trade in Bristol's wealth, was common knowledge at the time. The archives would form an important part of our research into opinions of the statue. The Bristol archives contain documents such as this image, which shows the unveiling of the Colston statue, with a large crowd gathered at the event. This suggests that the statue was popular, but more evidence would be needed to confirm this, such as newspaper articles. The Bristol archives do not contain many newspaper articles, so instead we would access articles from the British Newspaper Archive, as this contains some articles relating to the construction of the statue. The Bristol Museum collection does not contain many historical documents relating to the statue, but does contain a collection of images from the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest, in which the statue was torn down. And these are helpful in assessing the modern attitudes towards memorialisation of forced labour. Bristol City Council plan to display the statue in the Shed Museum, alongside protester signs, so, once open, this exhibition would also be useful in researching modern attitudes towards the statue. In the 21st century, when information can be disseminated by anybody, mainstream media such as newspapers, radio and television are still the main official channels to the general public. The most intuitive way to understand how people's attitudes have changed is to compare official attitudes in the past with those of today. It is possible to gauge the attitudes of contributors to forced labour from the words used in the press, and thus the attitudes of the official government at the time. The major local newspapers often work in partnership with the municipalities and can therefore be regarded as official media to some extent. Radio, as an early and still used means of communication, has a wider reach than the press. The direct words of the announcer are more likely to reflect people's views and attitudes towards certain events. The BBC published a report on the demolition of the Colston statue and quoted the office of the Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, and the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, as reports. It is clear from this that the views and the attitudes of the government at the time were that they wanted the public to resolve their differences in a democratic manner. Finally, the rapid rise of the internet as a new media has gradually begun to replace the existence of paper media as the main medium for people to obtain information. The destruction of the Colston statue has been reported by countless people who have expressed their opinions, both positive and negative, while the mainstream is mainly divided between those who oppose its demolition as a way of preserving historical heritage and the controversial school of thought that the statue should be removed altogether, while the rest of the public believes that it should be moved to a museum, or a plaque should be added to it to explain the statue's origin and controversy. These comments use the Colston statue incident as lead-in to reveal directly the attitudes and perceptions of the general public towards forced labour in Bristol today. Exploring public opinion can be considered an effective way to investigate how the memorialisation of forced labour has shaped the attitudes of Bristolians in the past, and how it continues to affect them today. Surveys and interviews can be used to gauge a wide representation of attitudes towards the memorialisation of forced labour within Bristol. A possible method of research would be to conduct questionnaires beside the empty plinth where Edward Colston once stood. Pedestrians in this area would be targeted, with an emphasis on Bristol residents. Interviewees would be asked a series of closed questions, possibly numerically scaled, followed by a few open-ended questions to collect subjective opinion. Given the population of Bristol is estimated at 463,400, a sample size of 384 is needed to produce an accurate representation of attitudes with a 95% confidence level and a 5% margin of error. Additionally, in-depth interviews with a variety of Bristol residents should be conducted to reveal comprehensive personal experience and opinions. These conversations will be transcribed and then analysed. It may be possible to obtain appropriate interviewees through the surveying process. To gauge how attitudes have changed, questions will focus on how individuals believe their opinions have changed over time, as well as their attitude towards memorialisation in the future. Social media is also an important part of understanding public opinion. Social media is a useful tool as it effectively allows researchers to gain an understanding of the general public's view, especially when looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and the removal of the Colston statue. This allows us to see the public's actual contemporary views, both for and against the removal. We can do this by looking at particular movements, accounts, and hashtags. We could look at a variety of different social media platforms, such as Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. A social media research group claims that qualitative analysis of a handful of tweets is synonymous to textual analysis of a number of person-to-person surveys, showing that social media can be used as a vital tool for research. Over the years, a surge of activism on social media can be seen. Looking at hashtags like hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Colston statue, hashtag Bristol, and hashtag Jen Reid statue would help us research our question, as it narrows what posts to look at. The hashtag Black Lives Matter hashtag has had an increased usage around the time as it was a prominent movement, especially after the murder of George Floyd in America, so it will show a large amount of people's opinions on the matter. It is important to look at accounts such as at UK BLM, the official Twitter account of Black Lives Matter in the UK. Also, to look at random people's accounts to get a wide range of views. It also gave Bristol Council a quick way to comment on the matter via their account at Bristol Council. When looking at tweets, you can see a contrast between people who are for and against the toppling of the Colston statue, showing that opinions in Bristol are mixed on memorialising Bristol's involvement in forced labour. This is shown on screen, with Javid stating he is unhappy with the removal, while others praise the Colston 4 and the replacement of the Jen Reid statue. To look more recently, on Twitter especially, the Colston 4 have received a lot of support on their trial on social media, with people stating that they believe that they should not be punished for their actions, showing a variety of opinions that can be shown on social media that are useful for research. We would use a variety of platforms, hashtags, and accounts to answer the question. In summary, the toppling of the Colston statue in June 2020 is a clear example of how attitudes to the memorialisation of Bristol's involvement in forced labour have changed over time. The toppling served as a manifestation of a change in attitude towards Colston and the legacy of forced labour in Bristol. Examining historical documents through Bristol's museums and archives lets us understand historical attitudes to the memorialisation of forced labour in Bristol. These can be contrasted against the public opinions of attitudes towards the legacy of forced labour in Bristol, such as the toppling of the Colston statue. Public opinions can be gauged through questionnaires, interviews, and social media to examine how attitudes have changed over time. Social media allows us to see the public's contemporary views, as well as how attitudes are continuing to change. Thank you for listening.